and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT how to play video. Today our analyst will be diving into how to play Dusk Jhin in patch 11.1. Despite Jhin receiving a nerf, he's still one of the best backline carries in the game. Because of how much damage he can do, it's easy to fit him into multiple compositions, but today we'll be mainly focused on the primary meta build he's used in, Dusk. We'll be covering the strengths and weaknesses of this comp, as well as breaking down items, champions, traits, and a brief look at each stage of the game. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video, and to begin, let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Dusk Jhin. Right off the bat, let's clear the air and say no, you don't have to play Jhin with Dusk. It's simply one of the better comps that Jhin can be used in. Because he's such a flexible carry, that brings us to the first and most prominent weakness of Dusk Jhin, which is being contested. Dusk champions on their own, specifically Riven and Cassiopeia, are fairly contested because the trait is just one of the strongest in the game. Added on top of that, there's Jhin, who's a commonly used 4-cost carry. And piled all on top of that is the fact that hitting a 4-cost isn't always reliable until level 8, so there are games where some players will hit everything you need earlier than you. The best way to play around this weakness is scouting. Scout to see what players have rolled during stage 3 after level 6, stage 4 after level 7, and when they've leveled to 8. Those timings will give you the best idea of who's playing what and whether or not you'll be able to pursue Dusk Jhin. The beautiful thing about TFT is that you're never hard forced to play one way or another, and you can always pivot, so don't fret too much if it looks like the build you want is being contested. Another weakness is somewhat tied to being contested, but more the fact that the build is very expensive. 2 of the core Dusk champions are 4-cost units, and Jhin himself is also a 4-cost unit. Just to 2-star those 3 champions is a lot of gold. Ideally, you'll be able to find the pieces of the composition between level 6 and 8, but sometimes you're going to have to spend a good deal of gold rolling on top of upgrading those champions. On the flip side of this weakness, the fact that a good portion of this composition is reliant on late game champions means it will scale really well. Once you hit level 7 and begin finding parts of the build, especially Jhin, your board will quickly stabilize. From there, you can continue to upgrade it and generally hit late game quite easily. And the last strength to talk about is the flexibility of the comp, which mainly has to do with Jhin as a carry. Since Dusk can be used as a splash trait, you can fit Jhin and 2 other Dusk units into practically any comp, or even skip Dusk altogether. Basically, you're always in a position to change your board based on what you roll, since the only really important champion is Jhin. Let's move on now and talk about the core items for Dusk Jhin. As usual, the best way to break this down is to identify your item holders, beginning with your primary carry. In this case, the obvious carry is going to be Jhin. Therefore, you want to aim at finding items for him, but keep in mind that you can play universally good items and still do well. Items like Hand of Justice, for example, does well in the early game and can be used on both Jhin and Riven. This also means that utility items are great like Chalice, Zeke's, and Locket. Generally speaking, use Zeke's in your backline for Jhin, Chalice to buff your Riven, and Locket can be used either on your front or backline, depending on your comp. Later on in the game, you can also look for items like Zephyr or Shroud, as they can force other players to position in awkward ways that benefit your board. Anyway, let's focus back on Jhin. Ideally, Jhin wants sword items like Deathblade, Giant Slayer, and Infinity Edge. Giant Slayer is one of the strongest options in the mid to late game, since there's a good amount of high health targets to be hit. Rageblade is also somewhat useful on Jhin, but since it's kind of an awkward item to fit in other compositions, try not to build it too early. Defensively, the best item is going to be Quicksilver, though Bloodthirster can also be okay since it has lifesteal and damage. Guardian Angel is always useful, but generally if you make one, it will be prioritized on other champions like Riven or even Zillion. Lastly, one of the best items you can give Jhin is the Dusk Spatula, as turning him into a Dusk boosts his passive damage by a large amount. The next item holder to consider is usually going to be your secondary carry. For Dusk Jhin, that's going to be Riven, who also doubles as part of your board's frontline. Because of that, you should aim to give her mainly defensive items like Sunfire Cape, Bramble Vest, or Guardian Angel. Since she's the secondary item holder, you really shouldn't prioritize finding items for her, except in the case of something like Sunfire Cape, since that item does really well in the early game and can be used on multiple champions. It's worth noting that Riven can be made more of a carry. To do so, you'll still have to give her a defensive item, but the rest of her slots should go towards AP items to boost her damage. This isn't the best option if you have a Jhin, but it's a good alternative if you're unable to find him or if you don't have great items for him. With items covered, let's move on and talk about core champions and traits for Dusk Jhin. Well, it should be somewhat obvious considering the composition's name, but the build is going to focus around using Jhin as your carry, with Dusk as the main synergy. The core champions of the build are Jhin, Riven, Cassiopeia, Vayne, and Thresh. This will give you 2 Sharpshooter and 4 Dusk. You can drop down to 2 Dusk, but make sure that you're keeping Vayne to use as a Sharpshooter. Outside of those core champions, you can go several different variations. One is to go all in on Dusk by adding in Lilia, though you want to have a Dusk spatula for Jhin if you go this route. Another variation focuses more on the Sharpshooter trait, either going 4 or 6. Generally 4 is going to be better because it lets you flex in other champions and traits. Another option is to play for the late game with level 9 and legendary champions. If you play for that, look to grab Zilean, Lilia, Azir, and Yone as the priority 5-cost champions, and then fill in the rest of the board with whatever you hit. Now that we've touched on some variations, let's focus on what the build will look like at level 8 in a standard game. As we mentioned, you'll want Jhin, Thresh, Vayne, Riven, and Cassiopeia. Along with those champions, you can add in Aatrox, Zilean, and Azir. Azir can be replaced by another keeper like Jarvan until you find him, and Zilean can be replaced by Shen. If you do end up playing Shen and 2-star him, adding in Yone later is great for Adept. One last topic to cover before we move on to the stages of the game is what Chosens you should be looking for. The best in slot Chosen is going to be Sharpshooter or Cultist Jhin because that instantly gets you a Jhin 2 with increased stats. Of the two, Sharpshooter is definitely better since you can flex in a 4th Sharpshooter or replace Vayne with a better champion. If you're unable to find a Chosen Jhin, then Riven is a great secondary choice with either of her traits doing well. Other options include Mystic or Adept Shen or a Chosen Aatrox. And of course, if you get to level 9 without a good Chosen, you can always roll for any 5-cost Chosen. Keep in mind throughout the mid and late game that being greedy for your Chosen is not a good idea. If you're given the option of a strong Chosen, especially a 4-cost, take it and build around that. Alright, we can now get into how to approach the different stages of the game, starting with the early game. Besides reroll comps, the early game is basically the same for any composition. Try to maintain high health, level at standard intervals, and play for your strongest board. There are currently 3 timings that you can level to 4, either on 1-4 prior to stage 2 starting, 2-1, or 2-2. Leveling on 1-4 is called pre-leveling since you will naturally level at the start of the next round. The benefit of doing this, or leveling on 2-1, is to give yourself a chance of hitting an early 2-cost Chosen. Practically any 2-cost Chosen is going to be worth playing during stage 2 and usually will result in a win streak. Besides trying to high roll a 2-cost Chosen, you can look to pick up either a Cultist or a Keeper Chosen. Playing those 2 traits, especially together, can make for an easy mid-game transition since the plan will be to play Jhin and Riven. Another Chosen to consider is Vayne, either as a Dusk or a Sharpshooter. Vayne 2 can definitely carry stage 2 if you're able to play an early game board around her. Just make sure that you keep an extra Vayne on your bench to sell later. Thresh is also another great early game champion to look for as he can provide early Dusk and a lot of survivability with his shields. As for the timing for level 5, either pre-level on 2-3 during the carousel round or level afterwards on 2-5. The general rule is that if you can't make 10 gold interest at the end of the 2-3, it's better to just pre-level, otherwise leveling afterwards is better. The goal with pre-leveling here is a chance at finding a strong 3-cost champion and potentially hitting an early 4-cost. As we move into stage 3, it's time to start to talk about the mid-game. The mid-game will begin around 3-2 when most of the lobby will be leveling to 6. It's okay to level slightly later if you're near 50 gold, but generally you'll want to level no later than 3-5. Stage 3 can mostly be skipped except for the players that had a weak stage 2. If you've lost a lot of health going into stage 3 and your board is still not strong enough, it's a good idea to roll a few times on 3-2 or 3-3. Basically, look to upgrade your existing champions, pick up any 4-costs you may hit, and look to play a strong 3-cost carry like Kindred. But try not to roll too much as you don't want to grief your economy. After stage 3, you'll be leveling to 7 on 4-1, which again can be delayed, but delaying it means that you'll have a higher chance of hitting 4-cost champions. The goal at level 7 is to try to stabilize your board as best you can while saving gold to level to 8 between 4-5 and 5-1. If you do need to roll on 7, this is a good point of the game to try and pick up pieces of the Dusk Jhin comp. Mainly look for at least a Jhin 1 and a strong front line, as that will be strong enough to get you to level 8. Generally, most players will look to hit level 8 on 4-5 and wait to roll, but if you have a strong economy and a weak board, you may want to roll 10 to 20 gold to try and stabilize your board so that you don't lose too much health before Raptors. Once you've leveled to 8, the idea is to simply stabilize your board and move towards the late game. Stabilizing means 2-starring your carry, in this case Jhin, and the majority of your front line. Ideally, you'll be able to 2-star most of your board during stage 5. And then we can move into the late game. The late game is all about 2 things: leveling to 9 and positioning. Positioning is far more important, so try to focus on that each round. The best way to get better at positioning is to scout a lot. See how others are positioned and move your units as best you can, and with a little bit of experience, you'll get better at knowing how to position. As for level 9, you'll usually want to do this sometime early on during stage 6. How early or late you level to 9 is entirely dependent on your economy and health. If you're low on health and won't have enough gold to level and roll, don't. Instead, use it to boost your board as much as you can with the intent of ending somewhere in the top 4. Otherwise, you can level to 9 and ideally have around 20 to 30 gold to roll afterwards. For Dusk Jhin, look for Zillion, Azir, Lilia, and Yone as the best 5-cost choices. From there, just try to upgrade the 5-cost units you can and play out the rest of the game by scouting and positioning well. That's all we have for today's video, folks. With set 4.5 on the horizon, we will unfortunately be saying goodbye to Dusk and Jhin, so we recommend trying out this comp before it's gone forever. Both Dusk and Jhin have influenced the meta for most of set 4, so it's fitting that they continue to be strong in the very last patch that they're a part of. If you have any favorite Dusk builds or Jhin builds, make sure to leave a comment below. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.